turning out tonight. And today's agenda, this evening's agenda, is basically twofold. First of all, I want to finish up some stuff left unfinished from last Friday, having to do with the characterology. And then we're going to have a titanium meeting and actually begin using our process to make things happen. So, last time we discussed the 5 different archetypal character structures, and the ones that I didn't do were the rigid, the ones I didn't describe in detail, the rigid, and the psychopathic, P-S-Y-C-H-O, pathic character structures. And I'm going to cover these pretty much simultaneously, and I'll explain why. First of all, they're not as well understood as the other character structures because they tend to be set up later in the child's life. And by later, the child has more internal resources and more flexibility in how to deal with the traumas that they are undergoing. Also, the etiology, which is to say the kind of experience that sets up the pattern, is similar between these two structures. And in fact, I have suspected for a long time that the psychopathic structure is actually a subset of the rigid. But I don't present it that way because the double bind is different. You remember we went through the 5 double binds, and the double bind of this structure is different than that of the rigid structure. But there are some similarities. So I want to start off with talking a little about body structure, physical structure. You see the most variety in these structures, much more so than you do with the schizoid, the oral, or the masochist. Those are very distinctive structures, where people with these structures are more varied. Also, the people with these structures tend to be more functional in our society, more successful in a variety of different ways. Body-wise, they look proportionate, left and right are balanced. They are not compressed or obviously shortened, the way we see in some of the other structures. And in fact, they tend to look healthy, normal, sometimes athletic. And so the body structures are very similar. Now, as to the issues, I will mention that I had mentioned earlier that the masochistic structure the dominant dynamic, if you will, is one of guilt. That the masochist rebels against authority and then feels guilty and lapses back into their same old pattern. Guilt is not an issue with either of these guys. Now, mind you, these could be men or women. But when they have an issue, an emotional issue, it involves shame rather than guilt. And that's true of both of them, although the psychopathic structure in its extreme doesn't have any such issues. They don't feel guilt, they don't feel shame, they feel very little of anything. Now let's talk a little about what are the events that set this up. I mentioned in the case of the psychopath there could be a genetic predisposition, extra X chromosome and so on. But apart from that, let's just look at the environment they live in and what they encounter. Both of these structures appear when certain events take place. Now, in small children, generally speaking, the child goes to the parent of the opposite gender to get permission to be sexual. And then goes to the parent of the same gender to learn how how to be sexual in our society. That's how they learn the culture of the society. Well, how does a child go to a parent of the opposite sex to get permission? Anyone have an idea on how that takes place? An example. A child goes to the parent of the opposite gender and says, if it's a boy addressing his mother, or a girl addressing the father, "Hey, I feel really good here between my legs. Would you rub me?" How does the parent respond to that? Well, an appropriate response is, "I'm glad that you feel good when you're touched there, but I'm not going to do that. It would not be appropriate for me as your parent to do that. But when you get older, you'll find all kinds of ways of getting that stimulation and enjoying it." So the response is reasonable, calm, encouraging, but not getting caught up in some interaction with the child that is basically sexual. Does this make sense? That is an appropriate response. Well, these kids who have these structures got inappropriate responses, and that set up a whole set of things happening. In the case of the rigid, well, I should say, generally, the inappropriateness that you get is one of two kinds, okay? One inappropriate response is the parent gets angry at the child because the parent's not prepared or equipped to respond appropriately. They hadn't anticipated what they were going to say, and they just blow up. This tends to be more often the case with the rigid than the psychopath, okay? But the other inappropriate response is when the parent, being approached in this way, responds seductively. Now, that can take a lot of different forms. In the mildest case, the response might be nothing more than a facial expression. Well, that's not an appropriate way to deal with this child who's discovering their sexuality. But it's a sexually suggestive gesture, and if the child doesn't recognize what that is then, they will soon learn to recognize that. A more extreme case is the parent actually complies and says, "Oh, sure, I don't mind rubbing you if you like that. Sure, here you go." That is an out-and-out physical seduction. And there are many degrees in between. In an extreme case, which is very common with psychopaths, especially with male psychopaths, the mother has out-and-out seduced them, and the seduction has been physically manifest. Okay? Mother having sex with the son. There are many instances of this, many examples of this historically. If you go to the literature, you'll find that a lot of the people who've been identified in the past as arch criminals had that experience. Clyde, Bonnie and Clyde, I think he was one. So anyway, so that seduction could be partial, could be consummated, and anywhere in between. And that is a feature that you see in both of these character structures, where the parent, if they don't get angry, they respond seductively. Most people have no idea how damaging that is to the child. I'm not even sure what the deeper dynamics are of how the damage is done, but I know it exists. I know it's very damaging. Okay, so that's something about where those patterns originate. Now, as for the body structure, I should also say that in the case of the rigid, although it's sometimes true in the psychopath, almost always true in the case of the rigid, the pelvis girdle has a lot of tension in it, and the hips are pulled back. And when you see a young woman walking around with her hips pulled back like this, rigid structure, no doubt about it. Well, remember, the rigid is generally the one who did not succumb to the seduction. They resisted it and were appalled by it. Little wonder that a young woman in that circumstance is going to hold her pelvis back so that her pelvis is not interacting with whoever's in front of her. And you'll see people hug with their, like this, hips pulled way back. It's a fear of sexual contact, particularly with a member of the opposite gender. And you see it in men too. Less pronounced usually than in women, but it's visible. And is a very, very indicative sign when you see it in the body. You're looking at this structure. Now that may not be the only component to the structure. You could have an oral or a schizoid underlay compensated for by the later rigidity. The bodies are rigid, by the way. You ask these people to do exercises of various kinds where you see how much flexibility they have in the body, and it's very little. The body tends to move like a chunk rather than like something fluid that bends. As for the interactional dynamics, we'll talk about the rigid first. You see a variety of patterns in people with the rigid structure: obsessive patterns, compulsive patterns, and those obsessions and compulsions can revolve around almost anything. Many of them have compulsion patterns that have to do with sex. I remember a young woman who every night as an adult would go to a nightclub, pick up a guy and bring him home, have sex with him, and then send him on his way in the morning, having had no real pleasure out of the interaction. That woman was incapable of having an orgasm. But she'd keep trying, unfailingly, over and over, thousands of times. Well, a lot of frustration in that kind of lifestyle, but it was a compulsion. Came out of this kind of structure and that kind of early experience. There are many other forms that obsessions and compulsions take. You can go to the literature and find lists of them. So part of what happens here is these structures are much more flexible in some ways. Even though they're rigid structures, there's more variety of behavior and attitude. You'll find that most gays and lesbians are in the rigid structure modality. Well, hardly surprising that some of these kids who were betrayed wind up really pissed off at the parent of the opposite sex. Hardly surprising. Am I making sense to you? Okay. Now, as for the psychopath is, there's a wide variety of psychopathy, from very mild to really severe. And the more severe the psychopathy, the more dangerous that individual is. And I want to say something about the nature of that danger. You or I, if we have some feeling that we want to communicate, our tendency is to go inside to where we have the feeling, connect with that feeling, and then express it from where we feel it. You gave a good example of that as you were coming in the door, talking about your experience in the straitjacket. A lot of feeling with that. Don't blame you. Psychopaths don't do that. The psychopath surveys his environment and figures out, what can I do to get what I want out of this environment? And then, without any connection with the feeling, goes up in his head and manipulates the people in the environment to give him what he wants. That's how they operate. Oftentimes, they're not even aware of having feelings. They do usually have feelings, but they're not connected with them. And so they manipulate their way through life. Some people refer to them, instead of using a long word like psychopathy or psychopath, they use the word sneak, because they're sneaky. They lie. They have no compunction whatsoever about lying. Rigid is much more likely to be compulsively honest. But the psychopath is compulsively dishonest. It's another form of compulsion, I guess. So they lie, they cheat, they steal, and they manipulate like crazy. And the ones that are not very good at it, the ones that are not very intelligent, wind up in prison. I should also mention that psychopaths come in two distinct varieties. One variety gets what he wants by overpowering others. This is the mugger who comes along and says, "Give me my money." He's talking about your money, but he thinks of it as his. "Give me my money, or else." They're frequently big and strong physically, and they get what they want by overpowering others. They're the ones that most quickly land in the brig, or in the prison. And then there are the ones who I think of as being the seducers. And they will seduce or persuade or trick you into giving them what they want. And they're good at it. These are the ones that are more intelligent, more successful, go on to be lawyers and politicians. And they're often successful in business. Either one of those two can wind up as a CEO in some corporation, make lots of money, and control their environment. They're very controlling. Psychopaths are known as control freaks. When you hear someone talk about someone else as a control freak, there's a good chance that person is highly psychopathic. Control freak. Why is that? Well, when they were kids, getting seduced by mom or dad, their life was out of control. And their whole life since then has been bent on acquiring control of their environment, which means of the people around them. Very, very manipulative. And even though they don't express feelings spontaneously, many of them will learn to mimic the expression of feelings. I remember one guy I met, he was a crook. He owed me some money. And I braced him about it. I didn't know at the time he was a psychopath, but I sure found out. And I basically said, "Hey, we have an agreement, we have an understanding, I expect you to pay me. You have some money, give me the money you owe me." Well, he had given me a number of excuses why he wasn't going to do that. So when I got insistent, he burst into tears. "Oh, you hurt my feelings." Bullshit. The moment I called him on that bullshit, he stopped crying. Instantly. It was all an act. It's interesting to know that there are people out there able and willing to do that. You don't want to run across them any more often than you have to. So those are the basics of the rigid and psychopathic character structures. As I said, the psychopaths are way more dangerous than the just merely rigid, because they don't have a conscience. They may have feelings, but they're not in touch with any feelings sufficiently to manifest it as a conscience. And they tend to be impulsive. They will do really weird stuff that turns out to be very self-destructive. They'll wind up in jail, they'll wind up in a mental institution, and frequently, if it's a mental institution, they'll go free. Because the mental health community doesn't classify them as being mentally ill. Isn't that bizarre? They're not mentally ill. They probably don't classify them because they don't have any way of treating them. The psychopath is a therapist's nightmare. You cannot get them to change. As I said once before, I only know of one case in history that I've ever heard of where someone who was largely psychopathic made a significant change. And they were highly, highly motivated, or they wouldn't have. Any questions on any of this? Okay. So that finishes up what we didn't finish up last Friday.
Do you want to do just a little review on the other ones just for the film, for the video, or no?
If you like.
Well, just, you know.
Okay, I can do that. I can quickly review the 5 structures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First, the names of them. Schizoid, oral, psychopath, masochist, and rigid. And I put them in this order. See, I just described the psychopath as being very close to the rigid, but I put them in this order simply because of the double binds that affect them logically fall in this order. Schizoid says to himself, I can exist if I don't need. The oral says I can get my needs met if I remain dependent. The psychopath says I can be independent if I never get emotionally close. The masochist says I can be close to someone if I give up my freedom. And the rigid says I can be free if I don't love. These are the 5 double binds that severely influence the lives of these people.
And would you say everyone is affected by, every person has would fit into one of these character structures?
That's a great question. I would say that in our culture, not necessarily every culture, but all the cultures I know of directly, everyone has one or more of these traits. Each character structure has a number of traits, and you can have a schizoid trait without the schizoid character structure dominating who you are. And many people are a blend. They'll have one of these as an earlier manifestation, but later on in their life they get caught up in one of these others as a kind of compensation. So it's not uncommon for someone who's basically schizoid or oral to appear to the therapist as being masochistic until they get through that level of deepening awareness, the therapy, and then the masochism kind of goes away and suddenly you're dealing with an oral or a schizoid. It's like peeling the layers on an onion.
Okay, but I'm probably not going to become a therapist in the near future.
Okay.
So, I mean, I do know that, if I encounter somebody I believe to be a psychopath, I just drop them immediately, don't ask questions, I just understand that's who they are, and they're not doing things to me, that's their habit, and I just got to get the way out of their way.
Mm-hmm.
So I just put myself away from them.
Right.
But obviously you can't run away from everybody. So
right.
If I can figure out what these people are as far as their character structure, then you want to deal with them in a different relationship, I would guess.
That's right. That's right. And depending upon who you are, you have different choices about how you go about that. Because from my perspective, I'm going to deal with them differently than I would recommend you do, because I have different experience. I am much more resilient to the shenanigans that these structures cause than you are, simply because I've been there. I know what's going on. But The schizoid likes to be thought of as special. The oral likes to be thought of as generous. I'm not sure what to say about the psychopath at that point, but the masochist seeks approval. And the rigid seeks pride. They're proud people. They like to feel like they can be proud of themselves.
So you basically just stroke that part of their.
I may. And I would recommend you do. I also might do the opposite. I might confront that in them under some circumstances. Depends. If I'm doing therapy with them, after I have a good solid relationship with them, I'm going to confront these things because they're not functional in these people as adults. These patterns got them through their early childhood. They survived their childhood using these patterns. So the patterns have value. But as adults, much less value. And we tend to think of people who exhibit these patterns as neurotic. Okay, so it's one way of defining neurosis. But yeah, most bureaucrats, for example, if you go to any government office, a licensing bureau, a regulatory bureau, any place where there's a lot of government employees, you're going to see a lot of these masochists in hierarchy. Well, they make good slaves for the people above them, and they make good slave drivers, if you can say such a thing, for the people below them in the hierarchy. They make good participants in hierarchies. Hierarchic leaders, who are usually not of that structure, love having masochists working in their organization because they seek approval, and they'll do almost anything for it.
So is the relationship roughly 1 out of 5 is each one, or there's more of some, less of the others, or?
In terms of the population at large, I'm guessing it's about even. Although you see cultural differences. In countries where hunger is common, you see a lot more orals. China, Russia, parts of South America where the hunger has been common, there's a lot of orality. Kids often are going hungry as infants, and that sets it up. In our society, and other totalitarian societies, it's the psychopaths that dominate. They like being in control. They gravitate to positions that let them experience that. The bodies of these people, since we're reviewing quickly, schizoid body shows a lot of splits. Left side and right side are different. Top and bottom don't match up frequently. Different parts of the face don't go together well. There's a cab coming in here. Discontinued. Okay. Anyway, oral body looks like an underripe banana. Skinny, low energy, lank hair. Masochist's body looks like an overripe tomato. It's full of energy that can't get out. Rigid looks like, someone with an iron spine. Rigid. Psychopath can look like anything. The ones that tend to overpower people, their bodies tend to look like they're this shape. Big at the top, weak in the legs. Big shoulders, upper body strength and all that. And the seductive ones can look like anything. They tend to be very well-proportioned, normal-looking bodies. As for their dynamics, the dynamics are in support of what they want with these things. In this case, it's control that they want. So these guys are frequently, very frequently, very spiritual people. It makes them special. Thomas and I know one who is oral schizoid, strongly both, and she's so special, she'll let you know within 5 minutes of meeting her that everybody thinks she's a guru. I don't think she's a guru. She does. She wants me to think that everyone else does, so that I'll think so too. Oh, you're so special. Well, she doesn't really feel confident that she exists. Every time someone says, you are so special, she hears unconsciously, you are. You exist. The oral has very little to be generous with. Frequently is communist or socialist in their politics. They want everybody else to share and share alike. Oh, they'll share everything. Well, they'll share, half of what they got from someone else. They'll share with you. And so it goes. I think that's enough review for now. At some point in the future, we can get into more detailed stuff like, if you're dealing with one of these people, what kind of verbal kung fu do you need in order to protect yourself against getting caught up in their drama? Because they will catch you up in their drama if you let them. And with practice and knowledge, you can learn not to be caught up in their drama, not to let that happen. Okay. So much for the characterology tonight. Now, it has been called to my attention, as if I hadn't noticed it myself, that we're not getting crowds of people in here. This Titania organization is not exactly on the move the way we'd like it to be. So we're going to use some of our technology, some of our know-how, to change that. Okay? Now, for the purposes of doing that, we're going to turn off these recordings, because it's not something I want recorded.